Daytime is on the move, and leading the way is The Young and the Restless, Daytime's most provocative drama, now at a new time.
As it stands today, the American soap opera is on the edge of extinction. In the 1969 to 1970 season alone, there were no less than 19 soap operas on air across the three major networks. However, with societal changes over time, the number of soaps on TV continued to shrink to the point where, as of 2025, only 3 serials remain on broadcast television.
The passion never ends on the doctors. Greta is determined to forget Billy. On Days of Our Lives,
are you my mother?
Will Sister Marie confess the truth? On Another World, Rachel and Mitch pledge their undying love. On Texas, it began as an innocent lunch but turned into a cause for jealousy. All this week on NBC.
Let's go back to that peak season of soap saturation from 1970, when a spooky gothic soap opera called Dark Shadows on ABC was about to make a leap forward no other soap opera before or since has achieved.
House of Dark Shadows, where death is a way of life.
Good evening. I'm Barnabas Collins. If I didn't see you with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it.
Barnabas Collins, head of a family of blood relations.
Julia, do you believe in the existence of vampires?
You're not really serious.
But he is, Julia.
Released in 1970, House of Dark Shadows stands alone as the only feature film adaptation of a daytime soap opera. Before we dive into the film, which for my money is an overlooked gem of early 1970s horror, we need to explore the origins of the series on which it was based and the man behind the show and the film, Dan Curtis. When Dan Curtis created Dark Shadows for ABC Daytime in 1966, the show was by no means a hit.
Dark Shadows probes the hidden mysteries of Karlen's house. Be sure to follow daytime television's first continuing suspense drama.
The series meandered around in the world of gothic drama with middling ratings.
Welcome to the beginning and the end of the world, Miss Winters.
I'm afraid I'm not going that far. Only to a house called Collinwood. Do you know it?
Yes, I do. Very well.
In a one-off attempt to boost viewership, a ghost appeared on screen with some noticeable attention in the ratings. The series entered the realm of the supernatural yet again when the character Laura Collins emerged as an immortal phoenix, and after that, the fix was in. Dark Shadows was now a horror soap, and Curtis resolved to add a vampire to the world of Collinwood. Needless to say, the show would never be the same.
Oh, madam, if you would, you may tell her that it's Barnabas Collins.
The linchpin to the success of Dark Shadows on television was of course the introduction of vampire Barnabas Collins, awakened from his 200-year slumber into the modern world. As played by Jonathan Frid, Barnabas ignited a pop culture zeitgeist. Although he started out purely as a villain, meant to exist only on a temporary basis for the latest story arc, Barnabas' popularity ultimately saved the show from cancellation. Over time, Barnabas became a more sympathetic character, as a tortured soul who eventually morphs into an anti-hero protagonist for the series. It may seem hard to believe, but Jonathan Frid as Barnabas was something of a sex symbol in the late 1960s.
The world's at rest and the darkness falls. Everything seems to be at peace. Perhaps that's why I prefer the darkness to the daylight. The gentle rays of the moon to the violence of the sun.
House of Dark Shadows in many ways fulfills the original intent of the Barnabas saga on the series. By existing out of continuity from the show, it repackages the sprawling soap opera into a more digestible format of 90 minutes, taking the best story beats and ideas without the baggage and filler of a daytime soap. And by virtue of being a feature film, even with a modest budget, the quality control and violence level are amplified by multitudes to great effect. Dark Shadows made no bones about its propensity to borrow from great works of literary fiction as its inspiration, indeed having loosely adapted the works of Charlotte Bronte and Henry James into the workings of the show. So it would come as no surprise that Bram Stoker's Dracula serves as the basic model for the Barnabas story, even if it's taking more from the Todd Browning Universal film adaptation than from Stoker's novel itself.
I bid you welcome.
This was true for the series, but the movie's ability to play faster and looser with the lives of our characters allows it to really take full advantage of the material. You can see this in both the way House of Dark Shadows follows the general outline of Dracula, along with a few specific examples. In the broader sense, the story is about a centuries-old vampire who enters the modern world looking for a bride, whom he will stop at nothing, including murder, to take for his own. Both Dracula and Barnabas take up residence in brooding Gothic estates, Carfax Abbey and the old house at Collinwood respectively, relishing in these mansions' decay and decadence for the past. Along the way, both monsters prey upon their unsuspecting hosts, and indeed turn lovely young innocent women into undead creatures of the night in acts of passionate lust. Karlen Stoddard and Maggie Evans can be seen as proxies for Lucy Weston and Mina Seward respectively in that regard. This analog between Karlen and Lucy I personally found to be the most intriguing, as both women get ferociously swept up by the animal magnetism of the vampire that ultimately leads to their death and rebirth as monsters themselves, before then hunting and preying upon their former friends and family.
I'm beginning to wonder, Cousin Barnabas, if I shall ever know you at all. There's so much about you that I'm dying to know.
Laugh all you like. I think he's fascinating.
Even post-mortem, the comparison persists as the vampiric Karlen, decked in virginly white, mimics the appearance of Lucy, the lady in white, who terrorizes small children in a London park, just as Karlen stalks her young cousin David. And of course, what Dracula analog would be complete without its own Van Helsing, provided here by Thayer David's Professor T. Eliot Stokes in a masterful display of bravado and authority.
I believe Karlen was destroyed by a vampire, and tonight she walks as one of the living dead.
There's no animal in this area that attacks people for their blood. There's no animal that strangles its victims.
Maggie Evans bears an astonishing resemblance to Josette. I'm convinced that tomorrow evening, the anniversary of Josette's death, Barnabas Collins intends to take a bride.
Among Dan Curtis' filmography, House of Dark Shadows remains some of his strongest work in my opinion. The evocative and disorienting point of view shots from the vampire's perspective are among the movie's finest mood setters. POV shots turn out to be quite a predilection for Curtis in this film, and work especially well in the lead-up to Barnabas' initial reveal as he approaches Collinwood for the first time in 200 years. As well, the attack on Daphne Budd shortly after Barnabas' release sets the tone for the mayhem to come. Shot with voyeuristic intent from the killer's viewpoint, mixed with shaky cam tracking shots, our victim seemingly escapes the suspected danger in the outdoor environment by making it to the safety of her car, only to meet her end within its confines. And finally, the assault and confrontation with the vampirized Karlen Stoddard is one of the movie's most startling and unsettling scenes. Masterfully staged and directed, it rivals anything from contemporary Hammer films of the day, culminating with a brutal and bloody staking through the heart by the clinical and cold Professor Stokes as police and even family stand by as witnesses. Quite upsetting to me when I first saw this movie as a teenager was the film's rather flippant attitude about disposing of a large number of its core characters. On TV, especially in a daily soap opera, it would be rather unthinkable to kill off so many characters in such a short time span. But here, they clearly weren't thinking about making any direct sequels with this cast. By the end of the movie, no less than Karlen Stoddard, Roger Collins, Dr. Hoffman, Willie Loomis, and Professor Stokes are dead, least of all Barnabas Collins himself. If there is any flaw to House of Dark Shadows, my only quibble would be the restoration of Barnabas to villain status after he became a much more multifaceted character on the show and in spin-off media like comic books and novels. I was pleased that, more so than I remembered on prior viewings, Barnabas is still nonetheless first presented partially as a sympathetic character, especially during the scenes where Dr. Hoffman's treatments allow him to regain some semblance of his humanity. But he's ultimately betrayed and persecuted by everyone else, and as a result, reverts to his monstrous ways. Despite his inherent murderous impulses, Barnabas usually doesn't attack his family unless provoked. But the incessant nosiness of Karlen Stoddard, inserting herself into Barnabas' affairs, forces his hand.
Get her out, Willie. She has desecrated this room. Get her out!
And as a result, because he needs to be vanquished in the end by a hero to save Maggie, that task falls to one of the many interchangeable and bland non-leading men from Dark Shadows lore. In House, that distinction goes to Roger Davis as Jeff Clark, about as charismatic as a block of wood.
One punch and nothing for me. Maggie, your drink?
Thank you, Jeff. Do you two know each other?
Yes, we do.
Another great thing about House of Dark Shadows is the connection with the television show. The movie begins almost exactly like an episode of the series, with the memorable theme song and a long shot of the foreboding Collinwood mansion while the title appears on screen. That great music, lifted directly from the show, perfectly fits the eerie tone of the film. In fact, the music is especially impactful because of the way it binds the movie to the show. Had this movie been directed by someone unconnected to the Dark Shadows mythos, the inclination to eschew the television series score in favor of something more cinematic might be inherent. But instead, Dan Curtis effectively utilizes and embraces many of the iconic music cues from the show to great success in creating atmosphere and mood. Moving on to the characters, our heroine is Maggie Evans, played by Kathryn Leigh Scott. This cinematic version of Maggie essentially combines two series roles into one as a matter of convenience and practicality. Scott plays both her original television character of Maggie, as well as adopting some attributes of the Collins family's original governess, Victoria Winters. Alexandra Molk, who played Winters, was a staple of the show since its premiere episode, and in fact opened the narrative for most early episodes, but had since departed Dark Shadows by the time of the film. And after all, since Maggie Evans was always the object of Barnabas' desire due to her resemblance to his long-lost love Josette, it just makes the most sense to transplant her to Collinwood to serve in both roles, instead of figuring out a convoluted way to explain her presence. Otherwise, one of my favorite characters in both the show and the movie is John Karlen as Willie Loomis, the groundskeeper who unwittingly resurrects Barnabas and becomes his Renfield-like caretaker. Loomis is by nature an unsavory character, to say the least, even in his extensively toned-down version for the movie. In the show, Willie was essentially a drifter who arrives at Collinwood with his friend Jason McGuire, who's blackmailing the matriarch of the family, Elizabeth Collins Stoddard. He weasels his way into Collinwood and presents as a major source of anxiety for the family in the pre-Barnabas days. But after his transformation into Barnabas' servant, Willie undergoes an actual metamorphosis of character and becomes an extremely sympathetic and surprisingly likable character, who at times tries to mitigate his master's evil deeds, as is replicated in the film. However, despite all of this, he ultimately remains a simpering, weak, and ineffectual fool. When tasked with containing an envious and unpredictable vampire Karlen, Willie fails rather spectacularly, igniting a chain reaction of events that leads to Barnabas' ultimate destruction. Although portrayed as a beta who at one point ends up giving his own life for his master, his final act of redemption gives him enough courage to turn the tables on Barnabas and destroy him along the way, which makes him even more of a tragic figure.
You tried to send her away from me, Willie! I never mentioned anything right to Who else did you trust her? Who else? Professor Stokes!
Barnabas may be looking for love, or at least what he believes to be love, but goes about it in the worst way possible, through lustful coercion. Indeed, the bite of the vampire has always had a sexual connotation to it, and Barnabas uses this motif to great effect, especially near the film's climax. Maggie Evans, the object of Barnabas' desire, is basically a modest and good girl at heart, seemingly devoted to her bland and safe fiancé. However, Barnabas, desperate to remake her in the image of Josette Dupré, his true love lost hundreds of years before, corrupts her innocence. After Barnabas is turned into a hideous and wrinkled old man by a jealous and scorned Dr. Hoffman, he begins his corruption by biting and drinking the blood of Maggie to rejuvenate his youth. Although Dr. Hoffman herself is at hand more conveniently as a source of blood, he instead strangles the doctor, who he feels no sexual attraction to, as punishment for her betrayal. Later that night, Barnabas enters Maggie's room to finish the job, and the once virginal Maggie removes her bandage and extends her arms and neck to the encroaching vampire. Completing the deed, Barnabas is utterly satisfied in the aftermath, with Maggie's blood dripping from his mouth. The symbolism is more than implied. Interestingly, Barnabas Collins and House of Dark Shadows itself in 1970 also reflects the end of an era of classic Gothic horror that began its cycle in the 1950s with the Hammer horror revolution. Like Christopher Lee's Dracula and Robert Quarry's contemporary Count Yorga, Barnabas shores up the last hurrah of the elegant vampire, decked out in formal evening wear, inhabiting the classic decrepit old manor. We would see this again with Dan Curtis' television film The Night Stalker and its vampire Janos Skorzeny in 1972 as a final coda of that lineage.
What do you want, Vincenzo? A testimonial from Count Dracula?
This era of the horror genre would soon be put to pasture by the oncoming next revolution brought on by the likes of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Exorcist. So with its wonderfully detailed Gothic atmosphere and aesthetic, House of Dark Shadows remains one of the truly underrated gems of early 1970s horror. Although fondly recognized by the cult following of the series, the movie deserves wider recognition as a true vampire classic. By existing as a self-contained story, it serves as a model to welcome in general audiences unfamiliar with the lore of the Collins family, and can also delight devotees of the soap opera who get to relive the highlights of the Barnabas saga in all its glory. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this review, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment below, and we'll see you next time.